Roald Amundsen, 1872–1928, remains one of the most consequential polar explorers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His career combined exceptional navigational skill, systematic preparation, technical innovation, and a practical understanding of indigenous Arctic and subarctic survival methods. Amundsen's achievements, most notably the first confirmed expedition to reach the South Pole and the successful navigation of the Northwest Passage, had profound scientific, geographic, and geopolitical significance. This essay provides a scholarly overview of Amundsen's life and expeditions, examines his methods and legacy, and situates his work in broader historical and historiographical contexts. Early life and formative influences. Roald Engelbrekt Gravning Amundsen was born on 16 July 1872 in Borge Østfold, Norway, into a family with maritime and commercial interests. The practical orientation of his upbringing, combined with Norway's seafaring culture, shaped his early career choices. He trained as a seaman in the Merchant Marine and later matriculated at the Royal Norwegian Naval Academy, though he did not complete a long naval career. Instead, Amundsen's interests turned increasingly toward polar exploration, propelled by the era's broader enthusiasm for geographical discovery and national pride in exploration. Two formative experiences stand out in Amundsen's early development as an explorer. First, his service on seal hunting and whaling vessels provided experience in high-latitude seamanship, ice navigation, and small boat operations, skills essential for later polar travel. Second, Amundsen was influenced by contemporary polar explorers and the growing body of polar science. He was an avid reader of expedition narratives and engaged intellectually with questions of meteorology, glaciology, and geography. Unlike some contemporaries whose exploits were driven by singular heroism or nationalistic spectacle, Amundsen's approach combined practical seamanship, methodical planning, and a willingness to learn from indigenous knowledge. Key expeditions and achievements. Northwest Passage, 1903–1906. Amundsen's first major expedition as an expedition leader was his attempt to traverse the Northwest Passage aboard Gjør, 1903–1906. The passage, an elusive sea route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, had motivated explorers since the 16th century. Earlier attempts, including those of Franklin and McClure, had resulted in tragedy or partial success, but had not produced a continuous, navigable route. Amundsen's expedition was modest in scale and resources by the standards of imperial period polar ventures. Gjør was a small 47-foot sloop adapted for Arctic sailing rather than a heavily reinforced ice vessel. The strategy emphasized slow, careful progress, overwintering when necessary, and systematic observation. Crucially, Amundsen and his crew spent extended periods with the local Netsilik, Copper Inuit people, at King William Island, learning techniques for hunting, clothing, and sledging, and adopting practical solutions, such as using dogs for sledges and the design of furs and boots. This ethnographic dimension of the expedition yielded both immediate practical benefits, improving the crew's survival and mobility, and longer-term scientific data on meteorology, magnetism, and geography. In 1905, the crew made important astronomical and magnetic observations and charted parts of the archipelago. By 1906, Amundsen had effectively completed a transit of the Northwest Passage, though he did not traverse it in one continuous season. Nevertheless, the trip represented the first successful navigation of the passage and established him as a leading polar navigator. Belgian Antarctic expedition interest and decision to go south, circa 1909–1910. While Amundsen's Northwest Passage success was significant, his reputation and ambitions quickly turned toward the Antarctic, where the heroic age of exploration was in full swing. The race to be first at the South Pole became the focal point of international attention following Robert Falcon Scott's planned British expedition. Amundsen initially intended to mount an expedition to the North Pole, but when he learned of Frederick Cook's and Robert Peary's claims and recognized the political and evidentiary complexities surrounding those endeavors, he shifted his focus to the Antarctic. In secret, he organized an expedition that would aim to reach the South Pole ahead of the British. South Pole Expedition, 1910–1912. Amundsen's Antarctic venture aboard Fram, 1910–1912, showcased his methodological rigor and willingness to adopt unconventional measures in the context of prevailing exploration norms. Fram, previously used by Fridtjof Nansen, was well suited to ice conditions. Amundsen's plan included choosing skilled, physically capable companions, installing strategically placed supply depots, and using dog teams for sledging. His training regimen emphasized short, fast sledge journeys with dogs, careful rationing of food and fuel, and clothing and equipment adapted from Inuit technology. A defining feature of Amundsen's approach was his pragmatic adoption of Inuit techniques for cold-weather survival: fur clothing, the use of dog teams, and efficient, calorie-dense diets. This contrasted with Scott's British expedition, which relied more on mixed transport methods, motor sledges, ponies, and man-hauling, and clothing that proved less thermally effective under extreme Antarctic conditions. The comparative advantages of Amundsen's strategy became tragically apparent in the outcomes. On 14th December 1911, Amundsen and his 4 companions, Olav Bjaaland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, successfully reached the geographic South Pole, planting the Norwegian flag and securing a historic first. Amundsen's leadership style during the Antarctic expedition was characterized by close attention to logistics, discipline, and decisiveness. He divided his party into teams, prioritized rest and acclimatization, and maintained a rigorous schedule for depot laying and progress. The return journey was completed without loss of life among the polar party, an outcome attributable to his conservative pacing, careful weight management, and effective use of dog teams to pull supplies. In contrast, Scott and his companions reached the South Pole on 17th January 1912, only to perish during the return march, victims of exhaustion, cold, and depleted supplies. Scientific contributions of the expedition included extensive meteorological records, geomagnetic observations, and mapping of previously unknown coastal areas. While Amundsen's primary objective was geographic rather than scientific, the data collected by his team were of value to subsequent polar science. The expedition also provoked debate and sometimes bitter controversy in British and international press, fueled by differences in public expectation, national pride, and accounts of conduct before, during, and after the race. The Maud expedition and drift ambitions, 1918–1925, following his Antarctic success, Amundsen turned once more toward the Arctic. He intended to emulate and extend the Nansen drift experiments by purposely allowing a vessel to become embedded in Arctic pack ice to drift across the polar basin. To this end, he launched the Maud expedition, 1918–1925. Maud was built to endure ice pressure and to serve as a mobile scientific platform. Amundsen's goals included oceanographic and meteorological observation, magnetic research, and mapping of the Arctic. The Maud expedition encountered numerous difficulties, including prolonged entrapment in ice and logistical constraints exacerbated by the unsettled geopolitical climate following World War I. Scientific productivity was mixed. While valuable data were collected, the expedition fell short of a dramatic drift across the pole as Nansen had envisioned. In 1922, Amundsen temporarily abandoned Maud and traveled overland to Alaska and Canada, where he continued exploring and collecting data. He later returned to Europe. Maud's long-term scientific legacy was therefore partial, though it contributed to hydrographic and meteorological understanding of Arctic conditions and reflected Amundsen's sustained commitment to scientific inquiry alongside geographic achievement. Air exploration and final voyage, late 1920s. In the 1920s, Amundsen embraced aviation as a means to access polar regions more rapidly and to pursue new exploratory objectives. He recognized that advances in aircraft technology could revolutionize polar exploration by enabling reconnaissance, aerial photography, and rapid transport. In 1925 and 1926, he participated in a stratospheric balloon attempt and supported airline-based polar initiatives. Amundsen also planned an aerial expedition to the North Pole. Tragically, Amundsen's final expedition ended in disappearance. In June 1928, while en route to rescue Umberto Nobile's airship crew after the Italia crash, Amundsen boarded the Latham 47 flying boat from Tromsø. The aircraft vanished over the Barents Sea and was never recovered. Amundsen and the other occupants were presumed lost. His death marked the end of an era in which individual explorers could claim firsts through daring voyages combining seamanship, dog sledging, and emerging technologies. Methods, innovations, and leadership. Amundsen's reputation rests not only on his high-profile achievements, but also on his methodological innovations and managerial competence. Several features distinguished his approach. Emphasis on preparation and logistics. Amundsen placed extraordinary importance on provisioning, depot placement, and equipment reliability. He carefully calculated rations, sled weights, and fuel needs, and took pains to test clothing and sledging techniques in advance. Adoption of indigenous technologies. One of Amundsen's most consequential methodological decisions was to learn from and adopt Inuit cold-weather clothing and hunting techniques. This pragmatic borrowing demonstrated an openness to local knowledge that some contemporaries lacked. Use of dog teams and lightweight sledging. Amundsen's preference for dog sledges allowed faster travel and more efficient calorie expenditure compared with man-hauling. Dogs provided both motive power and, in extreme cases, potential food sources, though the latter practice raises ethical considerations by modern standards. Small cohesive teams. Amundsen favored small, carefully chosen crews whose members had complementary skills. This fostered operational cohesion and reduced the logistical burden compared with larger expeditions. Scientific observation within a practical framework. While primarily focused on geographic objectives, Amundsen's expeditions routinely collected meteorological, magnetic, and oceanographic data, blending practical exploration with scientific inquiry. Historiographical debates and controversies. Amundsen's career has been extensively analysed and occasionally contested. Early British press reactions to the South Pole race were mixed. Some commentators admired his skill and efficiency, while others criticised perceived secrecy or breach of gentlemanly conduct, particularly in relation to Scott. Historically, the narrative of an Anglo-Norwegian rivalry has sometimes overshadowed more nuanced assessments that place both explorers within broader cultural and institutional contexts. Several historiographical debates have centered on ethics and conduct. Critics have occasionally depicted Amundsen as overly secretive or opportunistic, arguing that his abrupt change of plan from the North to the South Pole involved deception or poor sportsmanship. Supporters counter that Amundsen acted within acceptable norms of exploration, that secrecy was a legitimate tactical move, and that strategic flexibility was necessary in a competitive environment. Role of local knowledge. Amundsen's utilization of indigenous techniques provoked reflection on the relationship between European explorers and indigenous peoples. While Amundsen adopted practical innovations, his expeditions still reflected asymmetrical power dynamics and extractive knowledge practices common to the period. Contemporary scholars emphasize the importance of acknowledging indigenous contributions to European polar success. National memory and myth-making. In Norway, Amundsen is celebrated as a national hero whose exploits contributed to Norway's emerging identity following independence in 1905. Scholarly treatments explore how national narratives have shaped public memory and sometimes simplified the complexities of polar history. Scientific and geopolitical impact. Amundsen's expeditions had tangible scientific outcomes. The geographic mapping of previously unknown polar coastlines, systematic meteorological observations, magnetic surveys, and hydrographic measurements enriched scientific understanding of polar regions. Although Amundsen was not primarily a scientist in the professional sense, his cruises furnished data leveraged by academic institutions and governments. Geopolitically, his achievements influenced territorial perceptions and national prestige. The opening of the Northwest Passage, while not immediately transformed into a major shipping route because of persistent ice obstacles, had implications for Canadian sovereignty claims and Arctic strategic thinking. Amundsen's success at the South Pole likewise underscored Norway's capabilities on the world stage and contributed to the era's exploration-driven diplomacy. Legacy and influence. Roald Amundsen's legacy is multifaceted. He is remembered as a meticulous planner, a master of polar logistics, and an early adopter of cross-cultural learning that improved survival in extreme environments. His methods, use of light, mobile travel units, dog teams, and indigenous clothing, have been recognized as exemplary in the history of polar exploration. He influenced subsequent generations of explorers and informed scientific practice in polar disciplines. Amundsen's life also invites reflection on the transformation of exploration from romanticized heroism towards systematic, technologically mediated inquiry. By the time of his death in 1928, aviation and mechanized transport were beginning to supplant the small-team dog sledge model. Yet his example reinforced enduring principles: rigorous preparation, respect for local knowledge, and a problem-solving orientation to hostile environments. Roald Amundsen occupies a central place in the history of polar exploration. His successful navigation of the Northwest Passage and his attainment of the South Pole were landmark achievements that combined seamanship, leadership, and adaptive techniques grounded in indigenous knowledge. Amundsen's career illustrates the interplay between practical competence and scientific inquiry, and highlights the complex cultural dynamics of exploration. While controversies and debates persist, particularly concerning ethics, national myth-making, and the role of indigenous contributions, Amundsen's methods and accomplishments remain a subject of enduring scholarly interest. His life illuminates broader themes in the history of exploration: the negotiation of risk, the integration of diverse knowledge systems, and the shifting technologies that have reshaped human engagement with the planet's most extreme environments. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps.